Okay, it is 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you everyone for coming to another online learning program with the Jewish Women's Archive. My name is Larissa. I'm the program manager here at JWA, and I'm really excited for us to get started with our program today and to introduce our guest teacher, Tali Putterman. But before I do that, I'm just going to go over a few introductory things. So the first thing is I'll draw your attention to the slide that's up right now with some of these tech items. So a lot of you have already turned on your webcams, which is great. I would encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to turn on your webcam so that you can be visible and to participate by turning on your microphone and speaking. But if you feel more comfortable, you're also welcome to participate just by typing into the chat box. So currently, you do not have microphone rights. I took those away just momentarily because I was hearing some background noise. I'm going to go ahead and turn those back on, but I just wanted to note that it's really important that when you're not speaking, that you mute your microphone, and you do that simply by clicking on that green microphone icon at the top of your screen. You see the picture of it on the slide. If you just click on it, you'll see a line go through it, and that means your microphone is muted. Otherwise, we can hear any background noise that you have going on. So I'm going to go ahead and give everyone their microphone rights back, but please, because you are not speaking right now, please, I should see everyone mute their microphone so that we don't hear any background noise. Also, if you decide to participate by speaking, we're going to ask you to raise your hand. So you'll see the hand raising icon at the top of the screen. You can go ahead and click on that, and then we'll call on you. And again, I just want to mention I'm hearing a little background noise, so anyone whose microphone is not muted, please, please, please go ahead and mute it. Thank you. So just a little bit about the Jewish Women's Archive for anybody who doesn't know about us. JWA is a national nonprofit dedicated to making known the stories, struggles, and achievements of Jewish women, both in North America and beyond. And on our site, you'll find the world's largest repository of materials about and voices of Jewish women. As you'll see here, our mission, JWA documents Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be agents of change. So it's not just about collecting these stories, but also about promoting them and demonstrating their value to the general public. And we do that through more traditional resources like our encyclopedia, our curricula for educators, and our profiles, but also through things like our blog, our podcast, and our book club. I want to give a shout out to all the educators who are with us today. You are our essential partners in sharing Jewish women's stories. You're the ones on the ground doing this work and bringing this rich and inclusive history into your classrooms. So thank you for being our partners. And with that, we're gonna get started with our program. Again, this is Education for Social Change, Teaching Young Jewish Leaders. And our speaker today is Tali Putterman, who is the 2017 winner of JWA's Natalia Twersky Educator Award, which is given out each year to an educator who's using primary sources creatively to bring the stories of Jewish women into the classroom. So we're very excited to have Tali here today. She lives in Boston and is currently working as the social justice educator and community organizer at Temple Israel of Boston. So I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to her. She'll say a little bit more about herself, and then we will get started. So Tali, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Larissa. I hope everyone can hear me, and I want to thank everyone so much for being here today and thank the Jewish Women's Archive for giving us this opportunity to learn together. So before I go into the goals of today's webinar, I just wanted to say a little bit more about myself and my story and why I think highlighting Jewish women in the classroom and teaching feminism is so important. And I also hope to be able to hear from some other people joining us about why this work is important to you. I hope that over this hour we can do some learning and sharing together, and it won't just be me speaking, but a shared learning experience. I grew up in South Africa and I attended a Jewish day school. And although my school wasn't particularly religious, it did abide by Orthodox ideology, which is the norm in South Africa. And because of this, the role of Jewish girls and women were very defined. Girls and women were not counted in a minyan. Girls and women could not read from the Torah. Women were not able to be rabbis. And even when I was in outside of the classroom spaces such as Jewish camp, it was very limited the role of non-Jewish women, how they could publicly lead and be Jewish leaders for modesty reasons. So it wasn't until quite a few years after I moved to the United States and began working at Temple Israel of Boston, which is a Reform community in the Boston area, that I began to learn a little bit more about different ways to practice Judaism. I was very unfamiliar with the Reform ideology, and if anything, I had been taught to look down upon Jews who were turning away and rejecting the true word of the Torah. I was asked to be a substitute teacher. I was a second grade teacher at this time, but for one class, I was asked to be a substitute for Rabbi Susie Jacobson's sixth grade class. At the time, Rabbi Jacobson was a rabbinical intern and a sixth grade teacher. And the lesson plan was for students to create their own rabbi figures, for students to think of themselves as rabbis and to think what parts of Judaism are really important to them. How did they really want to practice Judaism and how would they like to lead their community? Students were then able to vote for which rabbi figure they would choose to be their leader. Now, in my head, while I was teaching this lesson, it was a very limited view that I was holding of who can be a rabbi and who a rabbi can be. As I was teaching these young students, I was imagining that all the rabbis that were going to present were going to have to be men, that the girls in the class were going to need to change their gender for this activity to work. And it wasn't until the very first girl came up, her name is Jenny, and she got up in front of the class and she said, "Hi, I'm Rabbi Jenny," and she began to tell the class the facets of Judaism that were most meaningful to her, the parts of Judaism that she carries most dearly in her heart, and how she would be a strong Jewish leader for the community. And this was a really powerful moment for me because at that point I hadn't really realized how limited I had been, how my ideas of who I could be and what I could become Jewishly, how my upbringing had impacted those thoughts. Did I really not want to be a rabbi, or was that just something that wasn't ever a possibility for me? Was I not truly interested in leading prayer or being that type of figure? Or did I just never think that that was a possibility, so I didn't consider it? And it was that moment when I looked around and saw that that particular limit wasn't here for these children. It just wasn't even a consideration. But I did think about society and all the other messages we get from our schools, from the media, from our homes, from our religion, and all the other limits that are set upon us, the glass ceilings that we're not sure how to shatter. And it just became very important for me to think about highlighting Jewish women role models in the classroom and teaching our young leaders, our young Jewish leaders, that the future is limitless and we need to be able to recognize where these limits are set and think critically about them. So that's a little bit about my story and why I think that this is so important. But before we get started, I really, with the goals and the rest of the program, I would love to hear from some of the rest of you who are joining us today, some of your own story. So to take a minute and think about a moment in your life when you realized the importance of your work. maybe you're a classroom teacher, an educator, maybe you're not, maybe you work for social justice in other settings, maybe you have a completely different career path at this moment, whatever it is that you're focused on at the moment, to think of a moment when you really realize that was important, and that the reason that you do what you do has an impact maybe on others and those around you. Or in my case, like my story, it really impacted myself and how I see the world. So whatever is most comfortable for you, if you're able to share by raising your hand and speaking, I think that would be really great. But if you feel more comfortable typing it into the chat box, I'd really love to hear some of your stories.
Jessica, you're raising your hand. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. Sorry, my camera doesn't work. I don't know why, so just excuse that. Thank you, Tali. That was really interesting. I think for me, I do like kids entertainment as well as teach. And there was a camp for xenophobic, there was a lot of xenophobic attacks in South Africa, and there was a camp that we went to, like, to visit them, just to give them some strength. So we were playing with some of the kids, and I was teaching them like a dance. I didn't really think much of it. I didn't know if they were so into it or not. And then at the end, one of the kids came up to me and she gave me like a guest bracelet that obviously someone had given it to her as a gift. And her English wasn't great, and she just gave it to me. And I was like, no, 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 no. And then she just held it in my hand, and she just like smiled at me, and she wanted me to have that. And it was just something so small, but it just showed like how just being there for her meant something so much to her. And I didn't realize at the time what I was doing, but clearly it did make quite a big impact. So, yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing.
So we have a response in the chat box from Frances. She said, relocating to an area without Jews highlighted to me how much I was part of the Jewish culture where I had lived near Chicago. So I think now I'm more immersed in Jewish history to keep grounded in where I came from and to maintain a Jewish identity. And JWA resources really helped me to do that.
Awesome, thank you. I think we'll have time to hear from one or two others. If you feel comfortable raising your hand to share, or I noticed some people are still typing. We'd love to hear from as many as we can.
So we have Jessica, who I imagine is related to you, Tali, who said, I volunteered to be a mentor for a younger law student at my law school. Helping her out with all her questions has been an amazing way to see how much I have grown and learned since starting law school last year.
So it's great to have family and friends online, as well as people that I haven't met yet. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
We also have Roberta, who's just typed in to the chat box. Do we have time for one more, Tali? Should I read it out loud?
Yeah, let's take this last
Okay,
one.
so this is from Roberta. She said, I remember when I was first a youth group advisor, I began to fall in love with the community and teams I worked with. Even though I was intensely enjoying the work, I didn't realize how much of an impact I was having on the teams until one of the teens who was graduating approached me one-on-one and thanked me for working with them. She encouraged me to stay and continue my work with the community, and it was a very validating moment that helped me to see the impact I was having.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone who is sharing. And I think we can tell by these stories, we're having people who are working with teens and Jewish communities, in non-Jewish communities, and in law firms. We're all impacting the communities that we care about. And our work is meaningful to us and meaningful to those who we impact. So we're going to spend the next few moments going over the goals for the program and thinking about how we can use the spaces in which we work to work towards social justice and helping to create Jewish or non-Jewish leaders, safe spaces for those that are around us. So one of the goals for today's program is to discuss themes and teaching methods from my winning lesson plan, Henrietta Soul's Learning from the Past to Shape Our Future. I'm going to focus on this a little bit closer to the end on the specific lesson plan. The reason for that is because it is available on the JWA website. Later in the webinar, we'll be able to see how to access that, and there's also going to be contact information for me. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, to walk through them. So I didn't want to spend too much time on that in this hour that we have. But more, I wanted to think about why I created that lesson and the underlying pedagogies from that lesson. And that's really considering strategies to make classrooms liberatory spaces, freeing spaces for the students in them, spaces where the other is embraced. And by that I mean students who are non-white, students of color, queer students, any student who may not be considered the norm by society's standards. Spaces where students have agency and where students can see themselves as leaders and change makers. I specifically work in a Jewish setting, and so thinking about how our Jewish values, how we can reinforce our Jewish values, context, and understandings as they relate to social justice engagement in the classroom. So I want to begin with a quote from one of my educational heroes, Bell Hooks. And Bell Hooks says, "It's so difficult to change existing structures because the habit of repression is the norm. Education as the practice of freedom is not just about liberatory knowledge, it's about a liberatory practice in the classroom." So to think about this, it's not just about the content that we're bringing into the classroom. It's not just about making sure that we're teaching about Henrietta Sold or that we're bringing important Jewish women and highlighting feminism through the content that we bring. It's also through our practice. How are we calling on students? How have we placed the desks around the classroom? How are we positioning ourselves in the classroom? And how are we giving our students voices? How are we showing our students that they can share the knowledge and they can bring knowledge into our classroom? And one way that I really think about this, and something that I try to do a lot, is through stories. And that's what we're going to focus on for the first section of this webinar, is thinking about stories and why stories are important. So I'd love to first pose this question to the group of some of you are educators and some of you aren't, to the wonderful group of participants we have here in this phone call, to think about stories. Why do you think that incorporating students' personal stories in the classroom can create a space that values otherness and allows students to feel that they are contributing valuable knowledge into the classroom space? Why do you think that bringing stories might be important? Please feel free to share by raising your hand and speaking, or by typing into the comment section, whichever is more comfortable for you.
We have a couple people typing into the chat box. Oh, and Rachel just raised her hand. Why don't you go ahead, Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel. So I work with both Jewish students and non-Jewish students. And one of the big things that comes up when we're talking about differences and experiences is that I can only speak from my truth. I only know my own experience. And so we talk a lot about I statements and not you statements, and learning how to express exactly what we're feeling and experiencing so that we can understand other people's perspectives. And so I think that, you know, by giving a child the agency to share their own experience, and then hearing or seeing the response from other people saying, yes, I too have experienced something similar, or wow, I never knew that was something that someone could be going through, creates a sense of community and a safe space, so to speak, for other students to feel comfortable to share.
Great, thanks so much, Rachel.
We have a couple responses in the chat box. Roberta said, I know that stories are important for my students because they can relate the topic back to their own life or to someone else in their life who they know. We also have Abby, who said, when students share their stories, they see the power of being part of their Jewish community. connecting and supporting one another and hearing different perspectives to help us look at the topic in new ways. And Frances said, in my experience, it helps them understand they are not alone. Rachel expressed it well.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. These are all great. In my next slide, I just have some other examples of some that you already said. I think one of them that stands out most to me is how stories are able to disrupt stereotypes. I think today we can think about some of the political things that are going on, some stereotypes surrounding immigrants, around healthcare, around addiction, and when people are able to share their stories and create personal connections, it helps people, and as Rachel was speaking about our truth, it helps us to connect to other people's truth, and understand things outside of our own realm, our own world. And then how can that help us? Stories often inspire people to act. I might tell you that something's important. I might list statistics about gun violence, but when you hear stories, when you hear somebody share, when you hear somebody's personal connection, it can often connect us in a different way, and it's very inspiring to act. So for the next slide, and for the next few slides, I'm going to run us through a practical example, something that I run in my classrooms to help elicit student stories and ground them in Jewish text and Jewish stories as perspective. So this is an inscription of the birth of King Sargon of Akkad. I first taught this lesson plan when I was co-teaching with Jackie Weintraub, who's a PhD and very knowledgeable in ancient Near East history. That is personally not my strength. I was helped with the social justice and the storytelling part of this story, so I would really recommend, there's a link at the bottom if anyone wants to research more about this topic, about King Sargon, to go ahead to read from the experts. But this is a lesson that I first co-taught with her and then have continued to bring into my lessons because I think that it really grounds some of the storytelling in Jewish text and Jewish story, and also provides space for students to think about their own lives, their own stories, and bring it into the classroom. So this inscription of King Sargon of Akkad, he was a king of Mesopotamia. I tell my students well before we believe that the Exodus story took place, and this is how the story goes. My mother was a changeling, my father I knew not. The brother of my father loved the hills. My home was in the highlands where the herbs grow. My mother conceived me in secret. She gave birth to me in concealment. She set me in a basket of rushes. She sealed the lid with tar. She cast me into the river, but it did not rise over me. The water carried me to a key, the drawer of water. He lifted me out as he dipped his jar into the river. He took me as his son. He raised me as his gardener. So if we look at that text for a moment, I'm wondering if it reminds you of any other story that you may have heard before. Is anything familiar? Anyone can just feel free to comment if the story rings any bells.
A bunch of people saying Moses, Moses in the river, baby Moses.
Great. I'm seeing a lot of people recognizing this story is very similar to the story of Moses, which is often something that my students will recognize quickly as well, and it can be very surprising to them. Who knew that the Moses story existed well before the Moses story that we keep reading about? So I asked them about stories. I use this moment to connect us to stories. First, what does the story and the story of Moses have in common? Feel free to just type in any similarities that you might have noticed. What does this story and the story of Moses have in common? Seeing some responses, a basket and floating water, protecting the child. Great. Lots of people are recognizing some similarities. And so if we think about the parts that are similar and we think about their enduring message, can anyone think of a reason why this story is so important, why it is so enduring, why it's told so often? you have an idea.
So from Frances, she wrote the story of an outsider who becomes a leader as an insider. And Rachel said, a mother's protection of a child and his unlikely survival.
Great. Those are great. Any others? So something that that a lot of my students will draw from hearing these stories is the rags to riches tale that anyone can be a leader. And I pose the question, do you think Moses and Sargon's birth story play a role in them being leaders later in life? These were children whose births were concealed, whose births were hidden, who were not born into royalty, but both are very famous leaders in different traditions and powerful leaders. So I'm wondering if their birth stories played a role, if you think their birth stories might have played a role in their later leadership. If anyone has any thoughts about that, feel free to comment or raise your hand.
So Frances said, overcoming odds. That's a story that can be inspirational.
So I often use this moment to draw students' attention to their own stories and to think if anyone can be a leader, if Moses could be a leader, if Sargon could be a great leader, anyone in the room can be a leader. Oh, I see Jennifer has said children being separated from their parents and being forced to be independent is a common theme even today in children's literature, possibly forcing children to act independently. Very, very interesting. Who we are, our past, our stories impact who we are today, what's important to us. I'll often even start with the children talking about other things that are not relating it to justice issues. They'll say emojis and their dogs and acting and Broadway. What's important to us is really relevant to our stories. So to model, before I ask students to share some of their stories, I share a little bit about my birth story and how my birth story impacts who I am today and why I care to fight for racial justice in my work. So if you look on the screen, there's a picture of myself as a newborn baby. I'm right there front and center. And I was born in South Africa while the apartheid regime was coming to a close. And I was the first baby, along with the babies of color laying next to me, to be born without racial labels. And this moment definitely impacted the country as well as myself, my birth story, and how it shaped me as a person. So I was born in South Africa as a white baby with a lot of power and privilege, and with my birth was the symbol of post-racialism, that we as a society were moving past systemic racism, that we're moving past these racist laws, and we were all going to be equal now with equal opportunity. And this is a narrative that when I saw this newspaper and that I was in the paper with my birth, it was something that I was really excited about. I felt famous before I'd even really done anything. I felt very important. And I was being used, and my birth was being used as a symbol that I wasn't really able to understand. But the way that I did form that understanding was that we're now equal. Now everybody in my society, regardless of their race, regardless of their background, has equal opportunity. And I was blinded to the white power and privilege that I was holding and what that meant for me and the rest of my country. And it wasn't until many, many years later, lots of conversations with people who are different from me, moving to the United States, being engaged in a lot of reading and learning, that I became more aware of what that meant to be born white in South Africa, to be white in the United States. and the power and privilege that I do hold as a white person and the existence of systemic racism. And that was also a powerful moment to me. I realized how easy it is, or how I would describe myself, to be kind of a benevolent racist. How if you had asked me, I would have said, I'm not racist, everybody's equal, we should treat everybody equally. I don't think race matters that much these days. But really I was holding these beliefs and I wasn't challenging a lot of the structures around me that were upholding racism and white supremacy. So my personal birth story and me realizing that and coming to those conclusions has realized how easy it can be for children these days to be brought up with similar ideas that I had, unless we are purposefully challenging them and bringing them into the classroom. So that is one reason that I fight for racial justice. And I'd love us to take a moment right now. It's okay to take a moment to yourself to think about an issue that you really care deeply about, any issue, and think about a moment in your life when you decided to become more involved with this issue. So this is really putting yourself in the issue, not thinking about statistics, not thinking about why the issue is important to the world, but really why is this issue important to you? How do you bring yourself into the classroom space, into the issue? So we can take a moment to think, and then I'd love to hear from some people if you feel comfortable sharing out loud by raising your hand or typing.
Jessica, go ahead.
Okay, hello. So I'm really passionate about like self-awareness and also people asking for what they want in life. So often my students, like I'll hear them complain and be like, oh, it's not fair, no, no, no. And then I always say to them, what's not fair? Tell me, don't complain about it, because if you tell me, then maybe we can do something about it. But if you just moan about it, then nothing will get done. So I try and encourage them as much as possible, especially with young kids. They don't realize that they have the power to make a change. So I just try and reinforce that and remind them.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And I would definitely encourage you to think about why that's so important to you. You shared a great story about that is important to you and how you use that in the classroom. But if we can think about ourselves and a moment, maybe when you realize that for the first time, or when you discover that is so important, to bring yourself into the story. If you're able to think, you don't need to share, that was great, thank you for sharing, but I'd encourage us all to think about ourselves and how we came to our issues and where we fit in. So I see Francis typed, reading the speeches of suffragettes, we can use them in the classroom now, and if you cover the dates, they are still applicable, same issues, still working for equality. Thanks, Francis. When I recently led this in class with 5th graders, and some students were able to share their stories, and there was one boy who cares deeply about endangered or abused animals, and he shared a story about his dogs and how much he loves his own dogs, but when he walks to school, every time he walks to school, he passes these other dogs that remind him of his own, but these dogs that he passes seem to be acting in a savage way, in a way that leads this child to believe that these dogs aren't cared for, that these dogs aren't loved in the same way that he loves his own dogs. So he's using his own life and his own personal story to share why he cares about abused animals and why that is passion for him. Thank you, Roberta, for sharing your story about inclusion in the classroom, especially for students with ADHD. I realized this was important to me when I became a teacher for the first time and started reflecting on my own experience. As a student with ADHD who was particularly hyperactive, I often frustrated students. My first year teaching, I had a student with similar behaviors, and I noticed I was getting really frustrated with her. When I noticed she was like myself, I started thinking back to my own experience, often a negative one, and how I could be a more inclusive and accommodating teacher to help hyperactive students like myself. Thank you so much, Roberta, for sharing. I think we have time for one other story if anyone feels inclined to give one. Otherwise,
I think it's Lisa raising her hand. Go ahead, Lisa.
great.
Oh, Lisa, we can't hear you. I think your microphone is on mute.
Lisa, we're not able to hear you, so at the
Hello?
top there's a green.
There you are.
Great, we can hear you.
Is that better?
Hello, Lisa.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So I'd just like to share that an issue that I really care deeply about is connected to what Tally said before about animals. Just hold on, sorry, my dog is barking. And I am currently in charge of a petting zoo where I work at a school, and that's my responsibility. And I feel like getting kids involved in that and having like a committee of kids to share their experiences about the animals and how important it is to care for them and to take responsibility for them since they don't have a voice necessarily to take care of themselves. I think that's also a really important issue and something that I find really important that I got involved in.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks so much, everyone, for sharing. And if you didn't feel comfortable to share, I hope that you'll think a little bit more about this and bringing your own stories into the classroom, which will help model for your students how to bring their stories into the classroom and their truths into the classroom. So with that, we're going to shift gears just a little bit to focus more specifically on the lesson plan about Henrietta Sold that won this year's Natalia Tversky Award from the Jewish Women's Archive. And to shift into that gear, I'm going to read another quote by Bell Hooks that I think is really important. Liberatory pedagogy really demands that one work in the classroom and that one work with the limits of the body, work both with and through and against those limits. Teachers may insist that it doesn't matter whether you stand behind the podium or the desk, but it does. Acknowledging that we are bodies in the classroom has been important for me, especially in my efforts to disrupt the notion of professor as omnipotent, all-knowing mind. So thinking about this and thinking about the lesson plan, maybe some of you have read it already, maybe some of you haven't. A large part of that lesson plan involves a scavenger hunt and students learning about Henrietta Sold through their own, a scavenger hunt that I put together, but one that they could guide themselves through and learn about Henrietta Sold's life through their own guided learning. So this is something that scavenger hunts are something that I use in my classroom quite often. One of the reasons that I do that is because they're really fun and students ask me for them and are always asking, like, these are great, can we do more scavenger hunts? So I definitely try to use them in the classroom because of that. But another reason is more pedagogical, and that's thinking about my own body as the teacher and how I'm using it and how I'm using my power in the classroom. So I am the teacher in the classroom. I do hold the most power. That's something that I need to own. But I also try to think of healthy ways that my students can share some of the power with me and can have power in their own learning experiences. And when the goals of my lesson are to tell students that they can be leaders, that they can be agents for change, will they really believe that if we're always in one classroom, if I'm always standing above them, if I own the space and control most of their bodily movements? I like to show them that I trust them and that they've earned my trust. And while I wait in the classroom for students to come back to me for the next clue, for students to come back to me to keep the scavenger hunt going, that while they are guided around the temple and the space, that I trust them to be learning, that they are learning, and that they can guide themselves through their learning process. So that's definitely something that I consider, just how I'm using my body in the space, and how I recommend that some other educators or whatever your work may be to think about your power, who you are, and how it's being used in your spaces. And another part of my lesson plan, my Henrietta Sold lesson plan, is that students create their own social justice advertisement campaign. And this is really about bringing what we're learning in the classroom and bringing out Jewish issues and Jewish texts into the now. Because I do believe that it's really important to teach about Henrietta Sold, especially if you're in a Jewish setting. There's probably so many times, if you're reading the Tanakh, that it's very male-centric. If you're learning about the creation of the State of Israel, it's very male-centric. And this likely is also relevant in students' public schools or in any books that are available, that they tend to be male-dominated and that female voices can often be marginalized. So I definitely do feel that it's important to bring these female voices into the classroom, such as Henrietta Sold, but also to bring it into the now. Because we might have many students who are like, okay, but Henrietta Sold was, you know, all those years ago, why does that matter to my life? Why should I care about this? Why am I coming to religious school? This doesn't matter to me. So to try to use what we're learning and show students that we can use these inspirations and we can bring it into the now and we can use it in a way that really matters to something that we care about. So I started by creating a little bit of discomfort in my classroom. I know that gender inequality is something that my students already care a lot about. And so I was able to run some kind of activity using modern advertisement campaigns. So I have two up here as an example, and I'd love us to take a few moments to look at these advertisements, these Lego, modern day Lego adverts, and type into the comments anything that you notice. What do you notice about these? See a lot of people typing in about gendered coloring. I think we can make the assumption that the blue is supposed to be gendered towards boys and the purple towards girls. A very important thing that Rachel has noted is that the male one has agency. Men or boys can be creators, whereas girls are friends. Emma and Natasha are both white. Sandy. Francis has noted typical gender stereotypes, color, subject, occupations, activities. The friends only has girls in the box. Boys aren't even noted there. Thank you for noting that, Jessica. Boys are involved in active movement. Girls interested in hair. Thanks, Jennifer. Jessica has noticed that the girls might be inappropriately dressed, perhaps. And sexualized at a young age. So yeah, I think one of the things that my students noticed most quickly are these very same things. Boys can be creators, girls are friends. If you notice the age differences, they're pretty similar, 7 to 12-year-olds and 6 to 12-year-olds. And if you notice the abilities for the boy set, that seems quite complex. You can build planes, cars, robots. Whereas if you look at the girl set, it's pretty straightforward. It's kind of already built some big pieces, and then you can play with them. You can play hairdresser with them. There's really probably only one way you could really play with those Lego tools. Yeah, Jennifer said something similar, that there are really a lot of accessories and it's really less focused on the building. So these are some ways that our media creates limits for and stereotypes for these students, and it's definitely something that is all around them all the time, and an issue that I know happens to be very important to my students. So this is when I created a little bit of discomfort where we have some heated conversation, but we also have ability to make change. And we learned about Henrietta Sold, and we got some inspiration from her activist history. But now it's my students' time to bring themselves into the classroom and what they really care about. Where I work, I'm able to provide iPads for my students. Other people may not have this resource. You might be able to create posters or plays or other types of things. But my students are able to work together in groups about issues that they care about and create social justice advertisement campaigns where they really are the knowledge holders. They're able to put into their videos the information that they care about, and then they're able to share this widely with our temple community, with staff, with their parents, and they're able to say, our voices matter, we make a difference, this is what I care about, and I'm going to educate you about this issue, and bringing student voices into the classroom. So we are going to, it's already 1:45, we're nearing the end of this webinar, and I wanted to share this quote that really guides me in this work, and I wanted to share it with everybody else. And that quote from Kevin Kumashiro is, "The school needs to be an affirming place where otherness, such as racial difference or queer sexuality, is embraced, where normalcy, cultural or sexual, is not presumed, where students will have an audience for their othered voices, and where the other will have role models." This is something that I try to think about whenever I'm lesson planning, whenever I'm thinking about my pedagogy in the classroom. This is something that's very important for me, and I hope that as we all move forward, that we can try to keep this in mind in whatever profession or setting that we're in. I still think that this is an enduring message. So in the next few minutes, before I hand back over to Larissa, I would love to hear some of your ideas. This was a webinar that I was helping to facilitate, but I really appreciate everyone who engaged with it, and I do love learning from other educators, from peers, from students, from colleagues. So if you have any practices that you implement in your classrooms or the spaces in which you work that help people see themselves as leaders, that help students see themselves as leaders, and help affirm the voice of the other, I think it will be really helpful to the other people on this webinar to have some chance to hear from you. Feel free to share by writing in the comments or by raising your hand. I know we have some great people on this line. It would be great if anyone wants to share a story or share a practice or share a pedagogy that you feel is meaningful in your life. Okay. If anyone is still thinking.
Yeah, sorry, I have Rachel raising her hand. Go ahead.
Great. Let's hear from Rachel.
Hi again. So one of the non-Jewish programs that I help run is a peer mediation program where we train middle and high school students to mediate conflict among their peers. And one of the most important parts of our training is a bunch of role play scenarios where they practice what a mediation session looks like. And in those sessions, the students I'm training must both play the role of the mediator and also of the disputant so that they can understand, even if the conflict is over something that sounds dumb or silly like a broken pencil, to the disputant, that could be a deeply personal sign of disrespect or something else. And it just helps them get into the mindset of the people that they're trying to help. And I think that that can be expanded. Actually, this is Shira. Shira mentioned that can be expanded to a teacher-student model in any sort of classroom when you want students to understand what it's like to take on that leadership role. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I know. Sometimes, sometimes I'm running teacher trainings for teachers that work in religious schools, and sometimes we're talking about classroom management, having them role play scenarios where there's sometimes the teachers, sometimes the students. Kind of goes back to that same thing of having them really think like where they are in their students' perspective and where their kids are coming from when something comes up in the classroom. And then it allows them to kind of see that the way that they respond to that really does influence their kids and really what their leadership role really is in the classroom and how much they do affect the way their students kind of move on with the rest of their day.
Thanks so much, Rachel and Shira. That was really great. Thank you for sharing. I noticed someone's typing, so we might be able to hear from one or two others. We have a few more minutes.
I think actually while Marcella is typing, I might just share an example from Jewish Women's Archive. So we have a teen leadership program called the Rising Voices Fellowship that's for young women who are in high school. And for them, a big part of the program is articulating their opinions and their point of view through writing, specifically blog posts, and sharing those pieces online and with a wider public. I think, you know, not all students are comfortable standing in front of the room and speaking, or, you know, doing more kind of more like active things like that. But here we really encourage them to see writing as a tool for change, and also as a way to be a leader, just by articulating your opinions and helping people think about issues in new ways.
Thank you, Larissa, so much. See, Marcella wrote, my strategy is to raise the self-esteem of student leaders. And Sandy's written, for voices of the other, I connect stories of the Jewish immigrants to stories of modern day immigrants and refugees. It's a great way for my students, children of all ages, and adults in the synagogue, to connect with those who are new to the country. Thank you, Marcella. And I see Frances is typing, but I know considering the time, and Larissa has some things that she'd like to say before we close out, that we might move on, but we can still have time to read what others are writing while we're online. So I do want to thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you for participating. I really learned a lot from hearing from you all and hearing some of your stories. And I know that I have contact information coming up later in the webinar. So if anyone wants to connect more or share anything else, please feel free to contact. So I'll read quickly that Frances said, we did a history camp this summer and mixed group among girls in a youth organization and incarcerated girls. They got to know the other as they worked on performances based on research of women of faith and history. That sounds really, really fascinating. I'd love to hear more about that. Thanks. So Larissa, do you want to continue with?
Yeah, sure. Tali, first, thank you so much for facilitating this webinar. This is a really rich and interesting discussion. I hope everyone got a lot out of it, and I want to thank you again for being here and for putting so much work and effort into this. So we wanted to show everyone where you can access Tali's lesson. You can actually go ahead and click on this link if you would like. It'll open it up in a new window. You won't get kicked out of the meeting room if you want to look at it later. I think, as you know, Tali said and demonstrated, you know, these methods can really be applied to a whole wide range of content. So if Henrietta Zold is a good fit for your classroom, right, you can certainly do that. But you can also take a look at the lesson and take what you learned today and apply it really to any content, other Jewish women's stories, really whatever you're working on. This is Tali's email address. As she said at the beginning, she would be happy to hear from any of you. If you have any questions or want to follow up on anything we talked about today, please feel free to be in touch with her. I wanted to make one JWA program announcement. We have a relatively new program that's still in its pilot phase called Story Aperture, where we work with groups of participants and train them to conduct oral history interviews and collect stories from the Jewish women in their own lives and communities. We've done this workshop a lot with adult audiences, with individuals, but also with educators who want to conduct oral history projects in their classroom. So if this sounds like something that you're interested in, please, you see my email address at the bottom. Please shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to you about bringing Story Aperture to your classroom. Depending on where you are, it's possible to do an in-person workshop, or alternatively, we can provide you with the resources you need to implement it in your classroom by yourself. So again, if you're interested, please feel free to email me. I would love to talk to you about it. It's really important to us that we collect feedback after we do these online learning programs. Your opinions and thoughts are very important to us. So I would ask to just take a couple of minutes once the webinar is over. You can go ahead and click on this link and provide us with your feedback. It helps us create future programs and just continue to improve and make sure that we're giving our constituents what they want and what they need. So if you have a few minutes, we would definitely appreciate your feedback. I also just want to say that this webinar is being recorded and it will be put up online hopefully very soon. Once the recording is available, I will go ahead and send it out to all of you so you'll get it. And with that, we're ending a little bit early, I guess, before I officially say goodbye. If anyone has any last minute questions, if you want to go ahead and type in the chat box or raise your hand just before we go.
Thank you, Francis, for sharing that link. I think that many of us would love to check out more of other educators' work and what more of us are doing. It's always great to learn from each other.
Definitely. I see Francis is typing and Roberta. So Francis is